Okay, so this week we are going to look at expanding on what we did last week with the aperture priority and shutter priority. This time we're going to operate the camera in full manual mode. So in order to do that, a couple of things you need to consider. And again, likewise with what we did last week on the D70-100 series, you have to depress the button in the center of the mode dial and rotate it to the M to signify manual mode. Now, when we're talking about the, and you can see by the list of tasks for the practical for today, they are very similar to what we did with the aperture priority and shutter priority of last week. The biggest difference between this is that now you are not relying on the camera to create what it considers the acceptable reciprocal of either the aperture or shutter priority. Now you have to look at creating a proper image and using that skill set that you have of trying to balance between the volume of light that's coming into the camera and the amount of time that the shutter is allowed to remain open, again, to create a properly exposed image. Remembering the reciprocal agreement of one stop of aperture is reciprocal to one stop of shutter speed. So to demonstrate how, by setting it into manual mode, how we adjust both for the aperture and shutter speed. Again, waking the camera up by partially depressing the shutter release button. You can see that the camera is set in the manual selection mode. By rotating the subcommand wheel, it will adjust the aperture setting of the camera. And likewise, when you rotate the main command wheel, it will change the shutter speed of the camera. Now, unlike what happened last week when you would alter one and the camera would alter the other, you do not see a difference in, it does not automatically change. You have to rotate both of them yourself. So as we discussed in the lecture, depending on what effect it is that you're trying to obtain, now you have to calculate yourself as to what you want for the alternating effect. So what I mean by that is, for instance, if you're trying to freeze frame a particular subject, then you're going to need a fast shutter speed in order to freeze frame that image. Because the shutter is only open for a brief amount of time, the amount of light hitting the sensor is limited. So in order to compensate for that, if you have a fast shutter speed, you need to increase the volume of light that is allowed to strike the sensor for that short period of time, in which case you'll have to increase the size of the aperture, and obviously vice versa. Bearing in mind that you may not, if you select, for instance, a very fast shutter speed, and I'll just use an example of 1,000th of a second. Generally speaking, the aperture setting that you are going to require is going to be larger than what the camera actually offers. So you may end up finding that the image is dull or very dark image simply because for the brief amount of time that the shutter is allowed to remain open, the volume of light coming in, even a greater volume of light or a larger diaphragm, it simply can't get enough light striking the sensor for that brief amount of time that it is allowed to. Just to be clear, when it comes to the purpose of this exercise is to show the limitations of the camera. And it is an education, it's a learning experience that you're going through operating the camera. For many of you, or probably for most of you, it is new technology, new concepts that are unfamiliar to you. So there's not a problem with taking an excessive amount of photographs to experiment and to see the variance of the effects. Obviously, you don't need to submit every image. You're only required to submit the images that, that are referenced in the assignment for each of the different tasks. So we don't need to reinvent the wheel here, right? So you can use the, some of the references from your chart from last week with what corresponding aperture and shutter speeds seem to work effectively from that practical, and you can apply the same concepts for this practical. One thing to consider is the camera has a light meter built into it. So if you look within the viewing window, partially depress the shutter release button, and you will see that light bar or that light meter appear on the bottom of your viewing window. And ideally, you want that to be centrally located, the bar, which will, the camera considers that to be a good exposure. So if you're, and you can again play around with this by adjusting your aperture and shutter speeds, that you will see that bar move one way or another, either to the positive or to the negative, and you can use that as an example or as a reference to try and as a starting point for getting an acceptably focused and exposed image.